Okay. 3, 2, 1. We're live on air.
Bonjour, mon nom est Hamid Georjani. En ma qualité de président de ce groupe aux réflexions sur le Moyen-Orient, c'est un grand plaisir de vous accueillir, vous souhaiter la bienvenue à la deuxième événement de notre programme pour cette année. Aujourd'hui, je suis très heureuse d'accueillir notre conférencière distinguée, Dr. Trita Parsi, et son Excellence, Madame Peggy Mason, en tant que modératrice de cette discussion de fauteuil. Without further delay, I would like to take a few minutes to introduce our guests. You have received a detailed biography of our guests, but I provide you with a quick overview of their expertise and the reason why they're here today with us. Dr. Trita Parsi is a distinguished scholar from US, and he has done extensive work in areas of foreign policy, international relations, and he has published a number of books, some of which have been award-winning books that are well recognized around the world. He's currently involved as a professor, and he's teaching courses related to his expertise. As far as Madame Peggy Mason is concerned, she, as I mentioned, she has been a Canadian ambassador to UN, and her expertise in that area were pertaining to peacekeeping, security, and with emphasis on different aspects of United Nations with respect to disarmament. Ms. Mason has also done some academic work, specifically with respect to training in regards to peacekeeping and also related issues pertaining to treaty compliance and so on. Madame Mason is the president of the Rideau Institute, a progressive think tank seeking to help revitalize Canada's global role through creative, innovative, and inclusive multilateralism, firmly grounded in the principles of the UN Charter. Recently, she was also elected as the vice chair of the prestigious Canadian Pugwash Group, and other activities that she has, you probably have seen it in the detailed biography that we provided. So without further ado, the floor is yours, Madam Moderator, and I will put myself on mute.
Thank you very much, Hamid. What a pleasure it is to be able to moderate this extremely timely event. Those of you who follow the Rideau Institute weekly blog will know that in considering what President Biden's foreign policy should look like, we have paid particular attention to recommendations from the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, an organization with a name that embodies in a nutshell the essence of the foreign policy being advocated and sought. And President Biden, in his remarks on 4 February on America's place in the world, has told us that, quote, America is back and diplomacy is back at the center of American foreign policy. While the signals seem rather mixed insofar as China policy is concerned, there is room, it would seem, for more optimism in some other areas. Against that backdrop, then, we hope today to focus on some key issues in the Middle East, particularly the potential for reviving the Iran nuclear deal, formerly known as the JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, as well as potential for the Biden administration to pursue policies to perhaps build on the successful reinstatement of that deal and the consequent easing of Iran sanctions to seek a new Middle East balance and regional responsibility for regional concerns through such policies as the initiation of an inclusive security dialogue in the Persian Gulf as a first step toward the creation of a new security architecture for the region. On a personal note, I have to say that I was enormously encouraged by the appointment by President Biden of Robert Malley as his Iran envoy. Robert Malley served in the Obama administration and is seen as a key architect of the landmark 2015 nuclear deal. He has spent the last 3 years as head of the prestigious International Crisis Group, in my view, a leading non-governmental organization in advising on the peaceful diplomatic resolution of disputes around the world. To say that our speaker today, Dr. Parsi, has his finger on the pulse of these key Middle East issues is not to overstate the case in any way, as two articles that appeared in print today amply demonstrate. The first, in Foreign Affairs and written by Dr. Parsi himself, is entitled The Real Regional Problem with the Iran Deal. Some players prefer for Washington and Tehran to remain at odds. The second article, apparently in response, appeared in Haaretz, written by one of its editors, Ariel David, and is entitled The First Abraham Accords, When Ancient Israel and the Arabs United Against a Common Enemy. Nearly 3,000 years ago, King Ahab of Israel and other oft squabbling nations of the Levant came together to face the Assyrian Empire in an alliance whose importance echoes to this very day. Well, I think those two titles demonstrate just how lucky we are to have Dr. Parsi with us here today and how up to the minute this discussion is going to be. Before turning the virtual floor over to him, let me remind participants that you can type your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom middle of your screen. And I note that we have already received 2 questions by email. And it is now my pleasure to give the virtual floor over to Dr. Parsi for his opening comments of about 10 minutes. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. It's a great, great pleasure being here with all of you at the Canadian International Council. Terribly sorry that it has to be over Zoom. I would have loved to have been there with you all in person. When Hamid began speaking and welcomed you all in French, I have to admit I started panicking there for a moment because I was afraid that perhaps the expectation was that this presentation would be in French. You should all consider yourself extremely lucky that I don't have to force you to suffer through my French. On the issue of the JCPOA, this is indeed a very interesting and eventful period of time. We have seen how the Biden administration has taken office, but the early promise that at least implicitly had been given that there would be a quick return to the JCPOA. Early on during the campaign, the Biden administration talked about compliance for compliance, and that this would take place without any preconditions from either side, which sounded pretty straightforward. And I think the expectation that there would be fast movement, because at the end of the day, there are going to be elections in Iran in June of this year, which means that from mid-March and onwards, the Iranians are going to be in their political season. And as a result, the likelihood of effective negotiations is going to dramatically reduce. So not much more than roughly 2 months to be able to get some movement on this issue. Particularly mindful of the fact that no one knows what the outcome of the election is going to be, but there's a decent likelihood or risk that a conservative person will become the next president of Iran, who, much like Trump, will run on a platform opposing the JCPOA. Given that, however difficult it is now to put the JCPOA back together, it will be even more difficult, if not impossible, if you end up having the reversal of the situation of the past few years, where the Iranians were in the deal and the US was outside, if you now end up in a scenario in which the Iranians too wish to leave the deal. So the opportunity to be able to revive the deal is the strongest in the next couple of weeks. After that, we don't know exactly what the situation will look like. And I haven't seen any strong arguments or convincing arguments why the United States should take that risk. Nevertheless, despite that expectation, we saw a very slow movement from the Biden administration, which to a certain extent is quite understandable, because for those of you who have followed what's been happening in this country for the last 4 years know that we have a lot of internal problems, a tremendous amount of internal crisis. We just passed 500,000 deaths on due to COVID. We had to get back into the Paris Agreement. There's so many different things that needed to be done quickly. So I think to a certain extent, it's understandable that the Biden administration may not have been able to move as fast as many had expected. But there may be other reasons involved here as well. And we have noticed that a common problem that existed in the previous negotiations have resurfaced here, which is the two sides may be able to agree on a formula, but that in and of itself does not determine the mechanics of getting that formula up and running. In the case of compliance for compliance, there actually is agreement for that between the two sides, but there's no agreement on how exactly to get there and who should take the first step. The US side has said that the Iranians need to move first in order for the US to lift the sanctions. The Iranians have rejected that position and argued that since the US was the one who left the party, the agreement, it is the US that needs to take the first step. These issues are usually resolved quietly behind the scenes, and some sort of a mechanism is put together that allows both sides to move at the same time, while neither side then will be forced to lose face or compromise core interests. The reason why that hasn't happened yet is because the two sides have not been talking to each other directly. And because the Europeans have not played the mediation role or the facilitation role that they played in the past. In fact, the little breakthrough that exists that came into place last week was mostly due to interventions by Qatar, not by the Europeans. And this goes to the very core of the problem. The reason why the two sides are not talking directly to each other right now is because the Iranians are very nervous that if they engage with the Biden administration right now without the Biden administration lifting sanctions, which essentially means that the Biden administration continues to implement the Trump administration's maximum pressure strategy. If the Iranians under those circumstances start talking to the United States and almost normalizes the situation, and then they don't manage to come to an agreement on how to revive the JCPOA, for whatever reason, it ends up not working out, and the Iranians pull out, then Iran will be blamed for the collapse of the talks, be blamed for the collapse of the agreement, even though the US not only was outside of the deal during Trump, but also during the period of Biden, the US never returned to the deal, yet the blame will fall on the Iranians. So this fear on the Iranian side seemed to earlier on have been overcome because of some quiet, indirect communications between the two sides that ensured that compliance for compliance was going to be the formula. Then it appears like that fear on the Iranian side reignited. And the reason for that was because the Biden administration started talking about the other side needs to move first, and giving hints that the sanctions may actually be useful as leverage, etc. And as long as that fear exists, unfortunately, the two sides are not willing to give each other the benefit of the doubt. We have to remember this. These are two countries with some very, very severe trust issues vis-a-vis each other for very good reason. Both sides have committed very negative acts vis-a-vis the other. And as a result, we have to operate this negotiation quite aware of the fact that confidence and trust between them is extremely weak. That makes the negative impact of any statement or any measures that can be negatively interpreted by the other side all the more effective and all the more problematic. And I think what is happening right now behind the scenes is that certain other countries are helping intervene, and the indirect communication between the two sides is much, much stronger than it was before in order to overcome this issue. Because these problems at the end of the day are in no way, shape, or form insurmountable. In fact, the interest of both sides to get back into the JCPOA is overwhelming. Returning swiftly to the JCPOA is even written into the Democratic Party platform. Choosing someone like Rob Malley, who was part of the previous negotiation, is highly respected diplomat, someone who really understands this issue, in and of itself was a clear signal of the intent of the administration to go back into the deal. Someone like Rob Malley accepting the position, I think, also has to be interpreted as him feeling very confident of the direction of the Biden administration on this issue. But even given all of that, we see the tremendous dangers and propensity for misunderstanding and suspicion when there isn't that direct communication between the two sides. So I think it's critical in the next few weeks that those direct channels are established so that there's an ability to not only de-escalate, but also to preemptively prevent any escalation as a result of misunderstanding. If that happens, and if it happens before the Iranians enter their political season, the plan, at least from the side of the Biden administration, is to go back into the deal and then as quickly as possible start negotiating what is called add-on agreements that would deal not only with whatever areas of the JCPOA that from the US side or the perspective of the Europeans and the United States needs strengthening, needs lengthening or become stricter, but also add-on agreements on or negotiations on regional issues, because as we all know, the JCPOA deliberately did not address the regional issues. It was focused on the nuclear issue alone. But there's problems in Yemen, in Syria. The US has major issues with Iran's involvement in many of these countries. The Iranians certainly have problems with the US's involvement in these countries. But that can only be resolved diplomatically. But in order to even get to that point, we need to first be able to go back into the JCPOA. The reason why these are called add-on agreements is because it's important to make a clear distinction. These new negotiations would be very important. If they succeed, in many ways, they would make everything stronger and better for all sides. However, they're an add-on agreement, not a renegotiation, not a new negotiation in that sense, because if they fail, they will not cause the collapse of the JCPOA. The JCPOA's fate is not bound to the success of these add-on negotiations, because that would give the many, many spoilers that exist in the region, as well as in the US, as well as in Iran, opportunities to not just kill the add-on negotiations, but through that also kill the JCPOA. So there needs to be a major buffer to ensure that the JCPOA is insulated from these add-on agreements. That is the plan, and I think the Biden administration has also signaled its strong desire to reassess its relations with Saudi Arabia, to move to help promote a regional dialogue that would include the Saudis, the UAE, and the Iranians, which I think would be a huge step forward. This region suffers from a tremendous diplomacy deficit. And the real leadership the US can lead or help with here is to help promote that type of a regional dialogue. It's much, much needed. But we cannot get to that point unless we first make sure that the JCPOA is revived, that there are no pathways for the Iranians to be able to get to a nuclear weapon. And from there on, both the regional negotiations can expand, but also bilateral dealings between the United States and Iran and the others. And in that context, that's where additional opportunities emerge, such as addressing the situation of human rights and things of that nature. Issues that could not be brought into the JCPOA negotiations themselves. I'll be more than happy to explain why the different sides chose not to do so. But right now, the JCPOA is the key to be able to get to all of these other issues. I'll stop there and take your questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Before going to the two written questions that we received, I wonder if I can just follow up a little bit on the European role. There was some reporting that that the EU chief they were going to issue an invitation for talks among all of the parties to the JCPOA. And there seemed to be some indication that that might go forward. That was last week, the Washington Post, I think in particular, that was talking about that. And maybe the broader issue behind that is why is Europe, the European Union, as a party to the agreement, why are they not playing the facilitative role that we all frankly expected them to play?
So I think, first of all, it's an excellent question. I think we have to make a distinction here. There is Joseph Borrell, who is the head of the EEAS, and then there is the E3. And they're not always necessarily on the same page. Borrell wanted to play that role. The Iranians welcomed it. I don't know where the Europeans were on that and if the US accepted it either. But it seems to me that potentially, and I want to say I'm a little bit speculative here, that part of the reason why the Europeans themselves did not end up playing that role is because there is a significant loss of confidence from the Iranian side vis-a-vis the Europeans, for the simple reason that the US left the agreement, reimposed the sanctions. The Europeans did issue very strong protests, very well-worded press releases. But when it came to actually making sure that they put forward a substantive opposition to what the US was doing, essentially making sure that their trade with Iran would continue, that did not happen. There were some efforts, such as the creation of Instex, an alternative payment system that was so small, but also designed not to violate US sanctions, which meant that it was not a replacement for the JCPOA because the US sanctions violated the JCPOA. And as a result, was never really going to be able to fly in the manner that at least it was presented. That lack of confidence, I think, may have been part of the reason why, that it wasn't that the Europeans didn't want to, as if the Iranians didn't accept it, because I thought it was quite fascinating that the Qataris stepped in. The Qataris have played a mediation role in many different conflicts, but if there was one country in the Persian Gulf that actually did play a critical role in the JCPOA, it was not Qatar, it was Oman. The Omanis played an absolutely essential role in the early stages of the negotiations to actually get the first breakthrough in secret negotiations. So I personally was a bit surprised to see that the Qataris had stepped in there. And I guess soon enough, we'll find out exactly what happened. The most important thing, though, is that there seems to be some progress.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you very much for that. And now I think I will turn to the two written. I'll start the two written questions we received. So the first one is, much of the current discussion of Iran's nuclear program focuses on uranium enrichment, but accumulating a significant quantity of highly enriched uranium is not sufficient to make a bomb. A working nuclear explosive device is also required. Given that Iran has not yet tested a nuclear explosive device and never revealed the entirety of its past work to the IAEA, how confident are you that Iran actually possesses the technology and know-how needed to fabricate a nuclear bomb?
I don't think anyone knows for certain as to whether they do or not. And that's part of the reason why the JCPOA was focused on making sure that the Iranians would not have the material necessary to build a nuclear weapon. Because that meant that even if they had the know-how because of previous experimentation, that know-how would be of little consequence because they simply would not have the material. So the entire focus, the formula that the Obama administration used was to make sure that the combination of inspections and restrictions on the program would be such that on the one hand, if the Iranians were to make a decision to build the bomb, it would take them at least 12 months to be able to build enough material for that bomb. So for instance, the JCPOA does not allow them to have more than 400 kilos of LEU, low enriched uranium, on their soil at any one point. You need at least 1,200 to build a weapon. But the combination of all of these different things would mean that the Iranians would need 12 months to get that material. And then, in order to make sure that there's no cheating, you want to have an intrusive inspections regime enough so that if they cheat, you can catch them very, very quickly. And mindful of the cameras and the instruments that are inside the Iranian nuclear program, the confidence essentially is that the IAEA would actually catch them keep cheating within 24 hours to a week, which means you combine the two. You need a full year of undetected secret activity, but you actually will be caught within a week if you do that. That is what creates such confidence that the JCPOA was so strong that it actually would close off any pathways to a nuclear weapon. So again, and that's partly because we may never be able to know exactly how much they knew about explosive, etc. So we had to set that aside and focus on, okay, what do you do to make sure that they simply don't have the material for the bomb?
Thank you. And I think, I mean, you've touched on another point, and I think this was one where there was a lot of confusion, or maybe it wasn't confusion, it was deliberately sowed confusion. And that is the different, the time limits on certain things. So the limits on highly enriched uranium being for a certain period, but the key point being that IAEA safeguards were in perpetuity. There was no limit on that. And I think that was a point that was not made, it was not made often enough, that the original...
Ambassador, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the critics of the deal, who of course have an absolute right to be critical of it, but they were successful in making it appear as if the deal entirely would expire after 10, 15 years, because some aspects of it does expire. And I explain why that actually is needed. And then, of course, you have that combination with some rather, I have to say, disinformation from the Israeli prime minister saying that this deal paves the way for Iran to get a nuclear weapon. There's no scientific argument that backs that up. In fact, the Israeli Atomic Energy Agency endorsed the JCPOA. Those are the experts that know how to build the bomb. But on the point of, sorry, I lost my train of thought here. We were talking about
some of the sanctions end, on why.
Yeah, why this? Yeah, so that is a very important issue for people to understand, because of course it would be amazing if you could make sure that a country that had engaged in problematic activities never could get to that point, or you can have permanent restriction. It's just not the way the world works. Right now, you have three categories of countries. You have nuclear weapon states that are part of the NPT, the United States, Russia, China, France, the UK. They have nuclear weapons and they're part of the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Then you have members of the Non-Proliferation Treaty that don't have nuclear weapons. That's the majority of countries in the world: Canada, Japan, Belgium. And then you have nuclear weapons countries that are not part of the NPT, such as Israel, India, Pakistan, now also North Korea. If Iran, as an NPT member, would then have enforced on it permanent restrictions, meaning that it, for instance, could not have whatever X amount of centrifuges that it wants permanently, then that would mean that we would create a fourth category of countries. Suddenly, Iran would be a country that is part of the NPT, doesn't have nuclear weapons, but also doesn't have the rights that other NPT countries have. You could potentially get that solution if you invaded the country and occupied it for 10 years, even though we've also seen that when the United States has done that elsewhere in the region, it hasn't really worked out. But the idea that you can enforce that on a country that hasn't lost the war and that actually has legal rights as recognized by the NPT is simply not realistic. Some of the demands that were put forward and pushed on the Obama administration, that on the face of it sound reasonable because actually they would be good if they could be achieved, were actually deliberately put forward to make it impossible for the negotiations to succeed.
Thank you for that. And of course, the key area is highly enriched uranium, not prohibited for a non-nuclear weapon states party to the NPT. So hence the logic of the limit being for 10 years. Okay, I'm going to go to the next question, which is getting into the articles that I referenced in my intro. This question is, your article published today in Foreign Affairs discusses Saudi and Emirati concerns with President Biden's plan to revive the JCPOA, and makes the point that they will need to be convinced that the US no longer has, quote, the interest and political will to continue to dominate the region militarily, for them to engage in good faith diplomacy with Iran and other regional players. But how will this work for Israel, given its strong domestic support in the US among both Republicans and many Democrats?
Thank you. That's a great question. I think first we have to start off to recognize that there's a significant difference between the predicaments that the Saudis and the Emiratis are finding themselves in and the predicament that, frankly, Israel is not faced with. Both have a very, very strong desire for the United States to remain militarily dominant in the region. A dominant America in the Middle East is something that would provide them not only with a security umbrella de facto, but it also dramatically shifts the balance of power to their favor. And they are currently enjoying a balance, at least the Saudis and the Emiratis are, that they cannot themselves be able to create with their own power. So this is, when even Obama talked about it as free riding on the US, this is what he's talking about. And it's understandable that if you are currently enjoying it, you don't want to lose it. And if you can do something to prevent losing it, then it is not necessarily irrational, at least not in the short term, to try to prevent that from happening. The Israelis are in a different situation. They too absolutely want to see the United States stay in the region. They too enjoy the shift in the balance. They do enjoy the maneuverability it gives them to have a strong American military presence in the region. But they, unlike the Saudis and the Emiratis, are actually extremely capable militarily themselves. It's an extremely sophisticated military, has not only the most sophisticated scientific and industrial base in the region, but also on a global scale, the Israelis are very, very advanced. You cannot say that about the Emiratis, for instance. Yes, they apparently hired some Japanese and American scientists to send something to Mars or a satellite in space. That doesn't mean that they, in any way, shape, or form, have their own scientific base and are self-sufficient. As a result, if the US were to leave, the Emiratis and the Saudis would be in a predicament. Israel will be quite fine. And let's not also forget, Israel not only has nuclear weapons, it also has a second strike capability because he has at least 7 Dolphin German submarines that are nuclearly equipped, which means that even if there was a nuclear attack against Israel, Israel has the ability to strike back. And there's no other country, with the exception of Pakistan, if you want to include them in the region, that even have nuclear weapons. So I understand from the Israeli perspective a desire not to lose some degree of the maneuverability, but it is not as if the Israelis are going to be in an extremely precarious situation, mindful of their tremendous power themselves. And this is where it goes to the issue of whether Iran is an existential threat or not. I do want to mention that 3 heads of the Mossad in a row flat out rejected the idea that Iran's nuclear program is an existential threat to Israel. That's not to say that they don't view Iran as a threat. They view Iran as an extremely, extremely problematic actor vis-a-vis Israel, a threat, but not an existential threat. And even Ehud Barak has been consistent on this point since 1992, because in his words, it completely belittles the tremendous power and influence and military capacity that Israel itself has. Now, in all of this, I do have to mention another point. Part of the reason why leaving the region is increasingly being spoken about in the United States is because the American public are absolutely sick and tired of being involved in these endless wars in the Middle East and seeing more body bags coming home and seeing how their own welfare and economic standard in the US is being sacrificed for missions in the Middle East that no one is capable of explaining as to why they're that important to the US in the first place. So, and at the same time, faced in a geopolitical situation in which whether one subscribes to the idea that China is a peer competitor to the US or not, nevertheless, the real challenges that the US will be faced with in this century are going to be towards the east of Asia, not in the Middle East. So why continue to have that degree of military presence at that cost in the Middle East when the US actually has its own concerns elsewhere?
Thank you very much for that. And that, of course, brings us back to your key point that the key to getting into this kind of a discussion is the JCPOA being fully reinstated. I'm going to go now to the list. I'm just going to start at the top. The order keeps changing here. I'm assuming, I don't know if that's because people are voting on them and moving them up or whatever. But anyway, I'm just going to start at the top and work down. Yes, I think I think so. Okay. So the first question, although that may mean that later questions are being asked first, I don't think there's any other way I can sensibly do it. So the first one, what is your analysis of the visit by the IAEA Director General to Iran? Has there been any feedback from Washington on this point?
It's an excellent question. As I see it, the head of the IAEA had to end up playing a role that he should not have to play. This is not what he should have to do, but he did it and he succeeded. The Iranians had passed a law in the parliament. This law was introduced by Rouhani's opponents. I don't think it was designed to be a pressure tactic against the US as much as it was designed to undermine Rouhani's diplomacy. That said, that if the United States has not lifted the sanctions by February 21st or 23rd, at least by the 23rd, the Iranians would reduce their collaboration with the IAEA, go back to 20% enrichment and many things of that nature. This is, of course, extremely problematic. It is yet another one of those steps the Iranians have taken in which they have reduced their obligations. But whereas in the past, when they were doing it, it was clearly seen as a response to the Trump administration just leaving altogether. Now it was taking place in a new context in which we were waiting to see, okay, what is the Biden administration going to do? The Biden administration, of course, viewed it primarily as a pressure tactic against the US, and I can definitely understand that is definitely how they're going to be seeing it based on where they're sitting. I think it's a little bit more complicated though, in the sense that when you look at who was pushing for it and the fact that the Rouhani government actually opposed it, I don't think all of that was theater. I think that they didn't want to have that bill. But so what happened is that the head of the IAEA goes to Iran and essentially strikes a compromise. The law will stand, it will be implemented, but additional things will be done to lessen the blow, and by that avoid a crisis that could have taken place today. That, mindful of the fact that there is no crisis today, it actually is an indicative that the IAEA mission actually was successful. What is going to happen is that it's a bit complicated, but let me just say one thing. There are cameras inside the nuclear program that are IAEA cameras. The IAEA is constantly seeing what the Iranians are doing. Those cameras are going to still be there, but the tapes are, for the next 3 months, going to be controlled by the Iranians. And the IAEA has its own mechanisms to make sure that they can't tamper with the tapes. If they come to an agreement and the JCPOA is restored and the US comes back into compliance and lifts the sanctions, the tapes will go to the IAEA. If not, well, then the whole thing collapses. But this essentially ensured that another 3 months was added to the clock in order to make sure that the JCPOA could be revived instead of suddenly having a crisis right now because of the JCPOA, because of the Majlis law. The reason I say that this is not necessarily the job of the IAEA is because I think this was an unnecessary political complication that came about partly because of the Iranian hardliners, partly because of some of the early rhetoric of the Biden administration. And instead of them resolving it themselves, it was the head of the IAEA that had to come in. And I don't know if he came up with the agreement, but nevertheless, he's clearly endorsing it, and it seems to be working. But hopefully there won't be there's going to be a lot of problems in the negotiations. What I think got people a little bit worried is to see that problems of this kind came so early, even before the two sides had started talking to each other.
Yes, you're certainly giving us the sense of how time is short, and the essentials have to be focused on. Okay, the next question: why should America at this point trust Iran and vice versa? Is the new European and American approach to Iran? Oh, sorry, it seems to have been cut off, the last part.
It's repeated at the bottom. I think he put it in there. Is the new European American approach to the Iranian regime not close or similar to the approach they offered to ex-Libyan regime?
Okay.
So this deal was never about trust. This deal was about verification. When it comes to countries that are at such difficult political situations vis-a-vis each other, you cannot rely on trust. You need to build a modicum of trust to be able to negotiate, however, and that was done during the Obama years. That unfortunately was destroyed under the Trump years because of what Trump did in pulling out. And I think the Biden administration may have had a bit of an impression or assumption that them simply not being Trump and them simply having had, the Biden administration is filled with people that were part of the Iran negotiations before, that modicum of trust is automatically rebuilt. That, I don't know if that was an assumption, but if that was an assumption, that would have been a rather courageous assumption. After 4 years of what Trump did and the suffering that the Iranians have endured because of the very, very painful sanctions, and on top of that, seeing that it's been a month and Trump's maximum pressure strategy is still the policy. It still hasn't been reversed. The US is still out of compliance. I mean, it took less than a week and Biden went back into the Paris Agreement and made a decision about stopping arms sales to Yemen, etc. But this has still not been done. Under those circumstances, it does further erode that modicum of trust that is needed, and whatever the Trump administration may have assumed would automatically come into place has not come into place.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to go to a question from a former Canadian ambassador to Israel and Spain. And his question, John Allen's question, is what is your sense of the openness of the Iranians to the add-on agreements regarding ballistic missiles and so-called Iranian support to terrorism? Where are China and Russia on re-engaging with Iran and potentially giving the US an early win?
Excellent question. I don't find it very likely that the Russians and Chinese are going to be motivated by giving the US an early win. And I think we have to remember why ballistic missiles were not on the menu last time. And it goes back to the NPT. The Iranians signed the NPT. As a result, they have an international legal obligation not to build nuclear weapons. And all of the P5+1 could agree on that. And as a result, there could be unity on that issue vis-a-vis Iran, so the Iranians could not play the Russians against the Americans and the French against the Chinese. When it comes to ballistic missiles, there is no such agreement that Iran is a party to. As a result, the legal basis, the legal framework did not exist. Moreover, it is a bit difficult to expect that the Chinese and the Russians would be on the same side as the US on that issue, mindful of the fact that other countries in the region have nuclear weapons and they have missiles with longer range than the Iranians do. So it's not as if the Iranians are introducing a technology that doesn't exist in the region. Even the Saudis have more long-range missiles than the Iranians do. And the Saudis spend 5 times the amount of money on weapons on a yearly basis than the Iranians do. The combination of the GCC states, I think, outspend Iran on weapons, even though their population is still not even half of that of Iran, with a factor of 10 or 11. So if we go outside of the NPT and we're not focusing on nuclear weapons, then we have to recognize these other countries in the P5+1 don't share the Western perspective on this. That makes it very complicated. So I'm not seeing them necessarily giving a win, but they could definitely be add-on negotiations. The question is how we design those add-on negotiations. If the idea is to disarm the Iranians of missiles, which is their core defense right now, after the revolution, when the revolutionaries themselves destroyed much of the Shah's army, including a very large number of Iranian pilots that had been trained by the United States. And after their own air force, what was left of it was destroyed in the Iraq-Iran war. The Iranians, who had very little access to funds, very little access to technology, made a decision that they simply could not reinvest in a strong air force. So they don't have much of a strong air force. Instead, they invested in missiles as an alternative. They didn't have access to American weaponry or anything of that nature. So the idea that we could go and ask them to disarm, not only make sure that they have no pathway to a nuclear weapon, but now they can also not have the defenses that missiles provide them, while we in the West, and that includes Canada, continues to arm the Saudis and the Emiratis to the teeth. I'm sorry, it's just not going to be a winning proposition. And I would be very doubtful if the Chinese and the others would want to sign on to that losing proposition. That doesn't mean that there can't be negotiations on how this can be regulated. But that means that part of the regulation has to be how much weapons the West sell other countries in the region, how much weapons and technology is being shared with the Emiratis and others. It cannot just be a one-sided thing. I mean, the JCPOA was not one-sided. It was sanctions relief for a reduction in centrifuges. A similar type of a give and take needs to be found on that issue. I think there's one area in which there is even an openness from the Iranian side, because they have rejected flat out that they would talk about missiles. But I think there is one area in which there can be conversation, and it's not on missiles, it's on missile proliferation. Because if the Iranians view the missiles as a core of their defense, they're not going to compromise that or negotiate that. That's one thing. But it is not a core of their defense to be able to spread that technology to the Houthis, for instance. So I think there's openings there that can be done. But I think it's very important for the success of these negotiations to recognize that if we want changes on the Iranian policies, and there's plenty of changes that are fully legitimate to be required, to be demanded or requested or suggested, it will have to come with a lot of changes in Western approach to the region. Otherwise, it's just not going to work out, and it's going to make it can actually be quite damaging to the prospect of future negotiations if there's just going to be one side that arms one side of the Persian Gulf to the teeth and then demands there's going to be a complete disarmament on the other side. That's just not going to work.
Thank you. And I might just add to that, of course, the Iranian experience of being on the receiving end of the Iraqi Scud missiles during the Iran-Iraq war. So sort of bringing home that aspect of the core defense. Now, the question next.
Could I add one small point on that, Ambassador? Because you remind me of something very important. Yeah, during the Iraq-Iran war, Saddam Hussein was using Scud missiles that he got technology from North Korea, and from the furthest western end of Iraq, he could still hit Tehran. The Iranians didn't have such missiles, so they had to be deep in Iraqi territory in order to be able to hit Baghdad in retaliation. So the disparity of capabilities there was just absolutely stunning. And that's their experience. And that's why I think it's going to be really tough if the focus is on this armament of missiles on one side, rather than focusing on the proliferation of missile technology.
Okay, I think you did touch on this, James Devine's question in your opening comments, but the fact that he's asked a question, it might be, I think, useful to go into it a bit further. It's now just disappeared. Here it is. The question is, given statements made by Anthony Blinken, Secretary of State, concerning the lengthening and strengthening of the agreement and the time frame for Iran being verified to be in compliance, can we be sure the Biden administration is pursuing add-on agreements rather than trying to renegotiate an expanded JCPOA plus agreement? I'm tempted to say, before turning it over to you, even the fact that that question is asked suggests that there's at a minimum, a messaging problem from the Biden administration, which is causing us anxiety.
I could not agree with you more, Ambassador. I know that at least earlier on, the plan was to quickly go into the deal and do the add-on negotiations. I'm not entirely clear what happened, what caused the delay, but the delay has raised suspicions in many different places. And the fact that those suspicions have arisen in countries with very, very friendly relations with the US and a lot of confidence in the Biden administration as a whole just tells you can just imagine then the degree of suspicion that must exist in a country like Iran that historically has been so deep in enmity with the United States. I'm not there yet. I frankly, at this point, I have not come to a point in questioning the intent. And as I said earlier on, with Rob Malley and others on, I would find it very surprising. But I understand that, mindful of whether it's messaging issue or whether it's a strategy that there seems to be so unclear, I can understand that these questions come into being. And I think that in and of itself makes it all the more important to make the messaging and the strategy clear, and in the case of the strategy, make the strategy faster.
Thank you. Now you have touched it. You did touch on this a bit in earlier comments, but again, this is an invitation to elaborate. Peter Larson asked, does the USA have an interest in reducing tensions between Iran and Saudi Arabia, or does the tension serve US interests?
I think that is an excellent question. And I think it, very much depends on who you believe defines US interests. I think there's going to be a tremendous amount of resistance to this from some of those who are making good money off of the tensions in the Middle East. I thought it was quite fascinating that Raytheon's CEO reassured his stockholders that they don't see, because there were some worry that Biden stopping arms sales to Saudi Arabia would have a very negative impact on Raytheon. And he reassured them that we don't see peace breaking out in the Middle East anytime soon. So we're going to continue to make good profits. I mean, it just tells you right there that this degree of tension has created folks that benefit from it, and as a result, probably would like to keep it as is. I can tell you that based on the conversation I had earlier on during the campaign or the transition, I don't think that the Biden administration is going to go for some sort of a break with the Saudis. I don't think they're looking for a bad relationship with the Saudis, but I think there is a desire to do some significant recalibration. Whether that recalibration actually does mean a significant amount of reduction of arms sales or not is not entirely defined yet, I think. But I think there is a clearer sense on this, that the Middle East has lost strategic importance for the United States. And if we don't do anything to help bring about a bit more of diplomacy between these countries and reduce their tensions, the ability for the United States to be able to shift its focus to what it defines as its number one area is just going to be next to impossible. I mean, remember, it was Obama who talked about a pivot to Asia. The Iran deal was a critical element of that, but that pivot never really happened. Biden has now made it very clear that the Middle East explicitly, I think it was the spokesperson, Johns Hopkins, said that the Middle East is not a top 5 area of strategic importance any longer. It's Europe, it's Asia, it's Europe, etc. That makes it quite clear where the priorities are and why suddenly there is a need for that type of reduction of tensions. That interest may now trump whatever profits others are making of the arms sales.
Just to add on that point of the arms sales, when President Biden announced the end to support for the offensive, for the Saudi offensive and the Emirati offensive capacity in Yemen, he did make that distinction with, but of course they would still be supporting, core territorial and military support for the core territorial integrity of Saudi Arabia. We've just got a couple of minutes left. Hamid has told me we got to make sure that he has his final 5 minutes. So I've got a question from Val Finley. Do you anticipate removal of the US obstruction of Iran's $5 billion IMF request for COVID relief, or the release of frozen funds as part of a good faith gesture, or as new agreements under negotiation?
I think that's a great question as well. And I would make a strong distinction between the IMF loan and the frozen funds. I think it would be very, very problematic if the IMF loan was one way or another put into some sort of a JCPOA package, because that would mean that the United States is deliberately, as the Trump administration did, but now the Biden administration would actually deliberately use COVID, pandemics, and relief funds as part of a negotiating leverage on an arms control issue. I think that would be a very unfortunate signal to send, and I don't think that is what the Biden administration is going to do. But it raises the question, why hasn't the IMF approved this loan yet? In my own advice earlier on to the administration was that this is one of the things that should be done very, very quickly, and make sure that to send a strong signal that the administration is not going to pursue the path of the Biden administration on this. When it comes to the frozen funds, there seems to be some movement right now. The South Koreans are saying that they, in conjunction with the US, is trying to work it out. Some of these delays may very well have been caused by the fact that there is such a web of sanctions and designations left by the Trump administration that to actually release these funds without breaking existing US laws could be a rather complicating thing. And it's not that they necessarily don't want to do it, but the banks want to know with full confidence that this is not going to haunt them later on. They're not going to get fined for it. And that can create, that may have created that delay at this point.
Thank you very much for that. And that brings me back, with some sympathy to the Europeans in their efforts to try and get around, not comply with the American sanctions. The weaponization of the American dollar, the fear that international business has of being fined. I mean, I think that really was a complicating factor that the Europeans were never able to overcome. But now I think I'm going to have to. I feel duty bound that you at least get a minute to make a final comment if you want to, and then we'll turn back to Hamid for his final comment.
I'm actually fine. I think these were excellent questions, really, really sophisticated. I'm delighted to have been spending this past hour with you all. So thank you so much for that.
Okay, is Hamid around?
Yes, thank you very much. Judging by the number of questions, we know that it has been a successful session. Dr. Parsi, thank you so much. It's no wonder you have been an award-winning author of several books, because you can cover so many areas simultaneously. And also, I'm delighted that we could have Ambassador Peggy Mason to be the moderator. And thanks to the participants for their active participation with the questions that they provided. And I also would like to thank our colleague, Samuel Auma, who has been providing us with technical support for these events, and also other colleagues at CIC. CIC is a member-driven organization, so we very much encourage you to become a member of the CIC so we can have more of these events, either as virtual or hopefully within a few months, I'm very optimistic, we will have in-person presenters like Dr. Trita Parsi to come and enlighten us with their comments and their analysis. So once again, thank you, Dr. Parsi. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Mason.
My pleasure.
It was a pleasure to have you, and I hope we can do it again. There
Absolutely.
is one last question.
Thank you so much.
If you want, I have 2 minutes, and I'll pass it on to you to see if you want to answer that question.
Sure.
Oh, okay. So you see the last question. Iran keeps proposing a regional security pact. Okay, go at it. I should have read the whole thing out.
I think to have a security architecture, at the end of the day, one of the key things that is needed to be done is to establish norms for how these countries deal with each other. The use of proxies is something that simply cannot continue to take place, because beyond the destabilizing effect, what it does is that it undermines the state in almost all of these other countries. It usually only can take place in the state that already has a relatively weakened state, but then it perpetuates that problem. I cannot foresee a functioning security architecture in which that type of a conduct and that type of policies are continuing to take place. What we do have to keep in mind, though, is that we hear a lot about the Iranian use of proxies, but they're not in any way, shape, or form alone. I mean, the Emiratis, the Turks, all of them are using proxies extensively. I think the difference is that the Iranians are probably more successful at using them for reasons I don't have an answer to as to why they have been more successful in doing so. For instance, if you take a look at the real partners we oftentimes call them proxies. I don't know if that's actually the right way of talking about Hezbollah, for instance. But the relationship that the Iranians create tend to be very solid and enduring. Whereas the Saudis have funded a lot of different groups, and within 6 months, they tend to turn against Saudi Arabia and even attack Saudi Arabia. That we have not seen that with what the Iranians are doing. But the point being, none of them should be able to do this. This is a key reason as to why we can't get diplomacy. I mean, if you take a look at how security was established in Europe, et cetera, is that you get certain rules for what can and cannot be done. Once those become norms, it becomes very costly to break the norms. Right now, there is no cost, unfortunately, at all to break because they're not even norms at this point, and that's really, really destabilizing.
Thank you very much. You have answered all the questions. And once again, thank you so much for taking time from your busy schedule to meet with us, Dr. Trita Parsi, and same to you.
My pleasure.
Ambassador Mason. We're delighted that you could moderate this session. And Samuel, as always, thank you very much for your help.